pas eu marché tout à l'heure. Ouais, je vais demander. Didn't work. Okay. No? Okay, okay. So don't start now. Look at me. I will check with the stream. And when you're ready, look at me. I'll make you a sign, and you can see.
You'll cue me. Okay. Yeah. Okay, ready to go? All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so this talk is about magicians and bureaucrats, which are two persona that I see in the community. And we've heard the term magician, and I guess I'd like to think about what we think a magician is. Each of us has a different concept. For me, a magician is somebody who creates, a creative person who builds. And then let's think about what a bureaucrat is. And we've been convinced, I think bureaucrats have a bad reputation. We've been convinced, I think, by people who want us to doubt the effectiveness of government or effectiveness of institutions. We've been convinced that bureaucrats are negative. But I see a bureaucrat as somebody who supports systems, like a system supporter, who guides and supports things. Who am I? I'm James Pitts. People call me Jamie out there. I'm a bureaucrat. I'm also a magician. I'm a bit of both, and I think all of us are. And so if you think about generally the Ethereum ecosystem, and it's kind of complicated and difficult to manage and difficult to understand. And so we need different kinds of people to help us understand it. We have map makers, we have navigators, and we have historians. I think those are three types of people who can really help us. And first, I think I'm going to start with some history of Ethereum, of the Ethereum community, and it's vast. And so if you think about what you see, it looks so complicated, like how did it get there? And my position on it, and I think history shows it, it was a very violent, beginning, and with a lot of energy flying around. And these factors from the early times that are still going on now, that's what creates the situation that we see. And if you think about what are the values of the community and where it comes from, we can generate a list. And it's like each individual you talk to out there, why are they in this? Why do they love Ethereum? Why are they in the community? I think there are several of these in each of us that's driving us. And so you'll see people who are really into Burning Man. You'll see cypherpunks. You'll talk to people who grew up in the collapsing times of the Soviet Union. And all these perspectives come together, and all of us have several of these. And so you probably identify with some of them yourself. And I see all of those factors leading to the original white paper, which was astounding and even had funny science fiction aspects of it. It was just the most amazing thing. I always like looking at it, and it's so raw and has so many great ideas. And you can see from the values like where it comes from, and it comes from a place going all the way back to the very beginning of hacker culture at MIT. And then all the way up to the financial meltdown and Bitcoin culture and Occupy Wall Street. You'll find a lot of people in the early Ethereum times who were involved with Occupy Wall Street. And so in the early days, everyone coalesced around the idea. And of course, Vitalik is an extraordinary person. He attracted a lot of people because of his benevolence and because of his brilliance. But I think that it has a lot to do with the ideas. And ideas are the things that have given people the ability to come together and work on something, even though they're very different. This is the original group in Miami. And this is a quote from one of the founders of Occupy Wall Street, or one of the leaders there. The project's driven by the idea. And so in the beginning, there's a lot of there's a lot of ideas and teams forming quickly. And in the early days, there was this mad rush to find a jurisdiction where you wouldn't go to jail for creating Ethereum or for funding Ethereum. And so that's how they ended up in Zug, Switzerland. They were considering lots of different places. And so this is DevCon 0. I like to think about this DevCon because this is the audience and the speakers of DevCon all together. And basically, the audience would just give a talk and then sit back down in the audience. That's how big DevCon 0 was. This was in Berlin. And the permissionless aspect is starting to emerge. And so in 2014, 2015, you could see like early ethos being formed and conflicts coming from that. And there was, and I don't want to specify names or anything like that, but in the early Ethereum project, there were some exits. And this was driven by a difference of values and a difference of principles. And in that time, the project gets funded. And so I think that's a very seminal event. Obviously, it created the financial basis for what we have. It gave them independence. They didn't have VCs. They had a community backing them. It also was potentially legally problematic, so that maybe they were thankful they all ended up in Zug to make this happen. And then the teams started merging. And so you see DevCon 1, now you can see things really starting to pick up, like people really getting into it. It's the permissionless culture is really happening. Teams are forming, nobody is in charge, but people are able to create projects. And some of it has to do with, there's a financial aspect, some of it has to do with just culture. And everyone can see that the technology is coming together. And so more things start to form. You can start to clearly see the community coming together and forming structure. Now there's this big split, another split that's important is, are we going to be commercial or are we going to be an open source project? This actually led to the consensus break off. Certain people left Ethereum project and started things like consensus out of that. And At this time, you start seeing the early governance of the protocol forming. And for example, the EIPs, you have this thing called pre-EIPs, and it starts becoming more formal EIPs. It becomes a more open process. And you see maintainers emerging. So 2016, 2017 was a very tumultuous time as well. You can start to see certain splits. One split is, is your organization going to be in a jurisdiction, or are you going to be decentralized, autonomous organization and take all the risks? And that's the DAO, or most of us pronounce it DAO. And they call themselves the DAO, which is hilarious. And so then there's this other bifurcation that happens that leads to the fork. We all know it, but it's a philosophical, it ultimately comes down to a philosophical difference. Code is law, or are humans in charge? And these are the social forces at play. And at the same time, we had key attacks happen. The DAO fork was driven by an attack. Then also the network was attacked, and it shows the resilience of the network and of the teams backing the network. It was a very important time. It showed that Ethereum cannot be crushed as a network and the community. Now, right now, I'd like to give a moment of appreciation for magicians. This is von Neumann, and that's Oppenheimer. And behind them is the first von Neumann architecture at Princeton. And this is basically the first modern computer. But one thing a lot of people don't know about von Neumann is he's an open source person. He took something that was basically commercial, he specified it in a document, he understood it from a theoretical standpoint, he specified it in a document, and then he sent copies of this thing everywhere, like all over the world. Critically, he sent a copy to IBM. IBM started making it. And next to him is Oppenheimer. One interesting thing that was calculated on the first computer here, the first modern von Neumann architecture implementation, it was hydrogen bomb simulations. It made the hydrogen bomb possible. So you can kind of think about the pressure that magicians are under, the forces at play. That's the type of character it takes to build something that is, you could even consider it a weapon, right? Like crypto is basically a defensive weapon, and it's a very tumultuous environment. So I think we need to appreciate that, and we do appreciate core devs, we do appreciate magicians, but I think we need to really recognize what they're facing, which is an adversarial environment. It's no joke. It's not. It is in game theory. It is in crypto, but it is direct. They can feel it. Our community, and so these are the dynamics at play in the community. The community has an anti-authoritarian culture. We're all probably personally anti-authoritarian to an extent. And so that might lead to a lot of contention. People are very opinionated. Many people are independently wealthy or just independent due to the nature of the technology. They don't depend on normal institutions. And so you get the classic internet troll effect. But on the other side of it, you have these networks of trust forming. And you see this in the core devs is a very good example. They formed a network of trust, even though they're from, I don't want to say it's adversarial as much, but there's different teams. Like you have the parity tech team, and then you have the Geth team, and all these different, and you have the team from Consensus. You have these different people coming together. They're forming trust in that, and I think we all can learn from that. And at these events, this is where we all love to communicate with each other and get to know each other. That's the trust. A key part of the dynamics are the communication media that we use. And as we know, we're just constantly on Twitter. We're constantly on the bulletin boards. Another dynamic is overfunded versus underfunded systems. There's this disparity effect. Certain projects are underfunded. Other projects have raised at an ICO, and they have the equivalent of $100 million US or something like that. Or competitive systems have raised enormous amounts of money. And this is one of the central points of the talk is that there's these two persona that we all have within us, but magicians and bureaucrats. And magicians create that explosive creative growth, and bureaucrats are, you might call it the dark matter of the universe, a gravity, something that holds it together. And so as you enter the 2017 era, a huge amount of energy goes into this galactic stew that we have here, this intergalactic stew. And it was very dramatic. And ICOs, I consider ICOs the first killer app of Ethereum. It enabled people to raise enormous amounts of money, irresponsibly often, but it was an incredible dynamic. At the same time, Bitcoin and other kinds of cryptocurrencies soared, and so that created enormous energy pressure in the system, and it attracted a huge number of people. At the same time, governance of the protocol became more professionalized. You could see that their notes are coming together. They have these public calls. This was critical, and there's a stabilization there. And I would call that a bureaucratic stabilization. Now, after the big crush, after the pop, it was an interesting situation. I call it the aftermath. Everybody. It was dramatic in retrospect, but it was kind of gradually being crushed. I mean, we all knew it was going to crash. We just didn't know how far, and so price of Ether kept going down and down and down, and projects were under more and more pressure. I see two big bifurcations coming out of this. The first one, I call it the libertarian socialist bifurcation, and this comes from that list of all those interesting sources of values in the community. And the classic is block rewards debate, in which do we do something like Zcash does? Do we raise funds in the protocol to provide common goods for the community, or do we just let things go as they go, like leave things laissez-faire type of situation? And so there's a lot of Twitter conflict between these groups. Another one is, I call it the libertarian technocratic bifurcation, and it's the similar thing. Libertarians let the market decide. Technocratic is, let's make an excellent network, let's make an excellent protocol. And the ProgPow debate, I consider, is the classic expression of that. At the same time, certain stabilizers occurred. The DeFi phenomenon is an incredible force, and it brought a lot of, I guess you'd call it, more normal industry input. Not to say that MakerDAO is normal industry, but and it's quite an extraordinary thing, but I think the process around it, if you look around MakerDAO and all the governance and all the work they've done, I see that as there's a lot of bureaucratic forces at play there. And the key one is Ethereum Foundation expands support in the community. Aya came on, and the Ethereum Foundation restored its grants program, and that became a classic way to support the community. And some people might even call it socialist, but it became a major grounding and kept us and kept many projects running in the community, things that needed to happen, but it supported projects through a time in which it should have been the Great Depression. And it was for many projects. It was basically the Great Depression, and we had an FDR kind of situation, a public works kind of program. And Consensus as well did a lot of things. And I think a lot of projects that did have resources or do have resources have helped us get through this time period. And so think about just kind of take it back to the bureaucratic forces at play. What is constraining the energy? And a lot of us point, like I was mentioning earlier, the Ethereum Foundation. We point to these organizations. And the media, I think the media would encourage this because, let's say, well, the Ethereum Foundation did something important today. But But the thing is, we have to remember it's teams. These teams are highly independent. Like you say, what is the Ethereum Foundation? And there are dozens of teams at the Ethereum Foundation, and some of those teams are bureaucratic in nature, and they help hold it together. You can't really say that there's such a thing as the Ethereum Foundation. It's really just people in these teams coordinating on things. And we have to understand that teams will cluster around resources. They need funding. They have nerds who want to make things happen. They go to the watering hole. They look around, where's the resources? How can I get my project going? And in an era, once the ICOs are over, there's no free money out there. And so, yeah, they have to start going to the watering holes. And then that requires guidance. You can't just have a phenomenon like this, come take my resources. And so the guidance, I call it the guidance system. Who are the people who help with this situation? And these are the bureaucrats, right? You have, even like myself in DevOps and IT, I consider that a bureaucratic process. You have leadership, you have administrative assistants, you have operations people. This sounds like very standard stuff, but these people are actually in a distributed organization trying to cope with this crazy situation that we're in. And they have these challenges. And for me, the first challenge is that power corrupts us. And so if you put people next to resources, and it's insane the amount of resources that people are next to here. You know, the Ethereum Foundation has enormous cash resources, enormous Ether resources. Consensus does as well. Many of the ICO firms that are working on projects do. This is enormous pressure on people. It corrupts people. And so I think people in the bureaucratic infrastructure there really have to have a lot of discipline, and they do. Obviously, we have widespread mistrust of authority in the community and widespread inexperience. And from that experience comes a lack of appreciation for the people who do the work day to day to keep the machine running so the developers can do what they do. And developers, magicians, researchers, and I'm about to say we, because I have done this professionally as a developer. We just want to do stuff. We just want to build. We don't want rules. And traditionally, we've worked at corporations. I mean, corporations are probably the main employer of magicians out there. That's what controls what magicians do. In the situation here, magicians have a lot more independence. They want to build without interference. That is a lot of pressure. And so administrators are trying to like organize that and guide that. And that's the pressure that you see in the grants programs. And then there's criticism of grants programs. It's like additional pressure. And then, of course, this is crypto. This is a dramatic space. This is crazy, crazy shit. And we basically have people trying to bring normalcy, trying to bring professionalism in an environment which is totally unprecedented. And so a moment of appreciation for the bureaucrats. They have traditionally have a bad reputation due to just what I think is manipulation of perception. In our community, there's all this distrust of authority, but I don't think this could exist. I think this would be a total disaster without bureaucrats. And so now I'm going to take a really quick tour to look at the some theoretical interesting ideas. We use the word cyber a lot, but what we need to know is that the term cyber comes from cybernetics, which goes back a long time, but since World War II, it really developed into this theoretical framework, and it was very conceptual. And it's how systems are organized. That's cybernetics. And so you'll have two different approaches. You have the centralized cybernetics of corporations and traditional institutions and Federal Reserve, those kinds of things. Then you have self-organized systems, which is a lot closer to what we're doing in this world. But it's not new. Often we like to think we're doing something new. We have discovered some really interesting tools, but we're people, it's the same thing. And so we can learn from the history of self-organized systems and the theories. Norbert Wiener, during World War II, he developed anti-aircraft systems. And the key things that he came up with was the notion that negative feedback can keep a system in check, can keep a system balanced. And so he came up with the mathematics and all these ideas about how systems can run. And a key is you think about positive feedback, like if I use this microphone in a certain way, you would hear that crazy feedback sound. Negative feedback is a way to correct for that. And that's how I see bureaucracy. I see bureaucracy as sort of like a negative feedback effect. One interesting insight he had was that you can decrease entropy through information. I used to think about information before I understood this, and I used to think, how can entropy? It was a conflict for me, the notion of entropy, and then seeing how things become organized. That just seemed contradictory. Things should collapse because of entropy. But he's basically saying you can in a localized sense, you can decrease entropy if you use information right. Hayek is very often cited in libertarian circles. He had some very interesting insights about self-organizing systems. This is something that might not be understood. People usually talk about them from an economic standpoint, and it is an economic concept. But his notion is that the price mechanism is the point of coordination enabling a decentralized economy. And I think this is a very powerful concept. It can be misapplied or can be over-applied in the sense that you would apply it to too many things, or you see that you could use it where maybe it's not applicable. But I think it's a very interesting notion. It's a very powerful notion. He came up with the concept of catallaxy. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It was kind of an interesting idea. And that's what led me to the idea of that this is a galaxy. Heather Marsh, who worked on WikiLeaks and Occupy Wall Street, she looked at a natural, something from biological scientists called stigmergic processes, and she talked about stigmergic society, that you could have these emergent, coalescing along an idea. You can have these emergent organizations and teams that don't need to ask permission from anybody, that don't need authority. And that really fits in, even though she's obviously not libertarian because she's fighting Wall Street, at least I don't believe she is. This concept is really similar to Hayek's notion that you're aligning on prices. That she's saying you're aligning on ideas to move a project forward. Falkvinge, I think I'm pronouncing his last name properly. He's from the Pirate Party. He's more of an organizational person, and he's applying some of these notions to how to build a political movement. And the key thing for him is to overcome Dunbar's number, which is we cannot, an organization can't scale because it's very hard for us individually to manage relationships, too many relationships. You can only meaningfully manage a certain number of relationships as an individual. And so that becomes a limit for the scalability of organizations. So organizations have evolved traditionally using hierarchies and command and control. He came up with the notion of cells, and he basically said, don't ask permission, start a cell, start a political organization, and just go with ideas, stick with the basic principles of us, but you can organize. And the Pirate Party succeeded beyond, definitely beyond expectation off of this one. And the interesting thing he had was, there is kind of a hierarchy, is that each cell needs to have somebody who come together in a different cell, at least one person, so that there's this overlap. So it's a bit of a Venn diagram. But he basically created a socially scalable organization, which I see things like the Ethereum Foundation as a very similar notion. Jo Freeman, feminist, she had just this incredible essay that Casey Detrio told me about, and it's called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And I would really recommend reading this, and I would recommend reading any of these things, but Tyranny of Structurelessness is a classic. Basically, it describes how in the feminist movement there was an impulse to get rid of hierarchy and to have everyone be an equal. And she was basically saying, you can't get rid of leadership, you can't get rid of structure. People just create a secret structure. She's really interested in the notion of opacity and open, that you can be able to inspect and see what's going on and have things clearly stated. And this is a problem in the community, is that we don't always know how to get started, and the structures are mysterious to us, and that there's a tyranny there, right? And so that's why having an open process is so important, having certain things stated, certain things formalized, certain things in a bureaucracy. These types of actions help address the tyranny of structurelessness. And so really rapidly, to finish it up, I'll go over some ideas about decentralized planning. And decentralized planning is a thing. It's not widely applied, but I actually think that we're learning how to do it in this community. And the idea is to facilitate what magicians want to do and to facilitate what bureaucrats need to do. I think something that's really important is any organization, any institution, any team, any unit needs to declare the principles, which are basically how you do things. I think it's really easy not to do that. And it doesn't mean you need to declare principles for the entire Ethereum community or anything like that, but just declare principles in your local sense. And these are example principles, and these are from Jo Freeman about democratic organizations. And this principle, if an organization adopts it, it's basically visibility as to who has what authority. That's not always clear. There's people who we see around the community, we don't know what their authority is. We just know they're powerful. That's tyranny of structurelessness right there. And so last part of here, she used the term democratic-based procedures. I would say consensus-based procedures. Democracy implies votes. I think consensus is a better way to think about it. Another principle, basically distribute the responsibility. And this is why we have almost the triggering fear of centralization in the community. So spread authority around as much as possible, delegate. I think that really prevents a lot of abuse, and she does too. So, another principle is openness and the flexibility of reformism within to a pragmatic extent. I think people this is what her Freeman's comment about tyranny of structurelessness is, that they took some things too far. That's why pragmatism is such an important notion, is that to apply that to any principle that you have. And I think I'll end it here, and it's basically to say that we have this explosive situation. We have this energy in the form of capital. We have this technology with all of this incredible potential that's attractive and powerful, dangerously powerful. Let's create a control system for that is still along the lines of our values, but that is still effectively a control system, even if it's decentralized, even if it's stigmergic in nature. And that I see that as what's happening, just given the history of Ethereum from the beginning. And it's really one of the things I'm most attracted by this society that we have here, is because we're being experimental, but we can learn from the past in order to build a better control system. It happens over and over again in history, and I'm pretty sure if we learn from that, we'll be able to persist without completely blowing this up. That's it. So I'm not sure if this is actually a really difficult format to have a discussion in. I was originally going to try to have a discussion with this talk. But actually, I'll end it right here, unless someone really wants to have a talk. I'll probably come down and talk. But in this giant room, I don't think it's too much of a, I don't think the format's good for it. But with that, that's it. Thanks. That it? Any questions? Okay, that's it. Yeah. All right, so bring in Mike.
So so thanks a lot for the talk. It was very interesting talk, very insightful about how you guys works between bureaucrats.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
I said thanks a lot for the talk. It was very interesting to see how you working between bureaucrats, because from the outside
Yes, definitely.
we see as a very efficient machine. You always talk about reaching a consensus.
Yes.
For me, blockchain is not about a consensus. It's not even desired. It's mostly incentivized.
Okay.
But I don't think it's even desired. How could we work without consensus? Does it make sense?
I think the key, thinking about that, in a technical sense, economic sense, I think what you're saying is correct, like about how blockchains are based on incentives. And I see that incentive design as a way to build a system, as a way to guarantee the security or to guarantee certain properties of a system. But it doesn't mean that the system's always going to function that way. Because it's just the messy reality of people. And so I think that's a good way to design the boundaries, the potential boundaries of a system. But consensus is something that it's a very human form of coordinating and communicating. And I don't think that human consensus is exactly possible using blockchain technology or even software. Those dynamics are so subtle. It's really the software designers and economic mechanism designers. I think they're about forming the constraints, the boundaries. And when people get in there, they're going to do all kinds of stuff.
But my point was even more meta than that, is would it then be better to have multiple Ethereum magicians working in parallel for different things, looking at different things in parallel, just like our Messy's startup ecosystem is, rather than try to map everything at the same place with the same order?
I agree with that, yeah. I think it is important that you don't have one, I guess you call it the principle of one way to do it. There's many ways to do it. And I think that's a principle from languages. Yeah.
I just want to piggyback a little bit on what you said, that consensus is a very human thing. It's in the human nature, but I think that as consenting as disconsenting is really human. So my worry is that we should actually be designing systems that consider those two options, how to agree or disagree, how to create value out of that agreement. I don't know.
That's right. That's right.
For
I see
me,
that
so
as
far, the
negotiation.
knowledge model is the thing that approach this thing more. It will be maybe nice to offer people that rage quitting to automatically create new kind of parallel organization that forks out of that.
That's right, yeah. Forking needs to be less extreme, even organizational forking. I think organizations should, this is something that isn't as fully developed. I mean, blockchains shows that it's possible and traumatic, but it's amazing that it's possible, and that really gets people thinking. You could fork the code base, you actually fork the system, the network, which is amazing. But I think, yeah, a lot of development needs to be done in order to do this in an organizational sense, that you say, we have different values, how can we part and still coexist and not destroy value? How to create more value, because you're expanding the potential expression, all the different expressions of our values. And so I could see why you would want that.
Yeah, not sure if you, I'm still just starting to follow Holochain, but I think, because I think that's the only paradigm that is considering that from scratch as a,
yeah. And you can even, I even consider Polkadot's architecture and the execution environment, the introduction of EEs in Ethereum too. I see this as a way to facilitate different value systems, still preserving the network, but enabling people to say, okay, well, we're actually going to fork, and we're in a less traumatic way. But I do think a lot needs to be developed for this, in a technical sense, but also just in a social dynamics sense.
Thank you.
Any more? Okay.
Anyone? Okay.
All right, good. We're done. So thanks. Thanks. For this second.